They called him a bandit.
They called him a liberator.
And sometimes
in the same breath, a threat to order
and a
hero to the people.
The Mexican Revolution did not begin with a single bullet or a marching army. It began in silence. In the quiet theft of ancestral lands,
the creak of boots on dry
soil,
and the weight of promises
it was
never
not just
kept.
a war between
It
generals
was not
or
just a war
politicians.
between
It
generals
was a
or
clash
politicians.
between two versions of Mexico.
It was a clash
one
between
ruled by
two
elites,
versions of Mexico,
the other
one ruled
demanded
by
the
elites,
people.
the other
From
demanded by the
1910
people.
to 1920,
From 1910 to 1920, Mexico would witness assassinations, betrayals, American invasions, and a carousel of regimes that rose and fell like dust storms on the northern plains. Yet even after the shooting stopped, one question still echoes. Did the revolution fulfill its promises,
At the turn of the 20th
or simply
century,
reinvent the chains?
Mexico appeared,
At the turn
least
of the
on
20th
paper,
century,
to be a rising
Mexico
power
appeared,
in Latin America.
at least on paper, to
Porfirio Diaz
be
had
a
ruled the
rising
nation
power
as a dictator
in
for
Latin
over 3
America.
decades.
Porfirio
Under
Diaz
his
had ruled the
regime,
nation as a
railways
dictator for
expanded,
over 3 decades.
Foreign capital flowed,
Under his
and
regime,
a
railways
cosmopolitan
expanded,
elite
foreign
emerged
capital
in the grand
flowed,
salons
and a
of Mexico
cosmopolitan
City.
elite emerged in the
But
grand
for most
salons
of
of Mexico
Mexico's
City.
13 million
But for
people,
most of Mexico's
this so-called
13 million people,
modernization came with
this
a price.
so-called modernization
One paid
came
in
with a
sweat,
price.
land,
One
and
paid in
silence.
sweat, land,
Over
and
80%
silence.
of rural
Over
communities had been
80%
swallowed by
of rural
haciendas.
communities had been
Massive
swallowed by
landed estates owned
haciendas.
by the few,
Massive
worked by the
landed
many.
estates owned by the
Entire
few,
villages lost
worked
their
by the
autonomy.
many.
Indigenous
Entire
lands
villages
were fenced,
lost their autonomy.
sold, and handed
Indigenous
over to cronies
lands
of the
were
regime.
fenced,
The promise
sold,
of economic
and
progress
handed over to
masked the
cronies
bitter
of the
truth.
regime. The
Mexico
promise of
had become a
economic
nation
progress
built on
masked the bitter
dispossession.
truth. Mexico
Into this
had become a
simmering
nation
cauldron
built
stepped
on
Francisco
dispossession.
Madero,
Into this simmering
an
cauldron
unlikely
stepped
revolutionary.
Francisco I.
Wealthy,
Madero,
educated,
an unlikely
and
revolutionary.
Madero
Wealthy,
was no peasant
educated,
firebrand.
and soft-spoken,
He was a reformer who believed
Madero
in
was
democracy,
no peasant firebrand.
not destruction.
He was a reformer
And yet,
who believed in
it was
democracy,
Madero who lit the fuse.
not destruction.
From
And yet,
exile in the United States,
it was Madero who lit the
issued
fuse.
the Plan of San Luis
From
Potosí,
exile in the United
a bold
States,
call to arms
Madero
demanding
issued the
electoral
Plan of San
reform,
Luis Potosí,
an end to
a
Diaz's
bold
rule,
call to arms
and the
demanding
restoration
electoral
of land
reform,
rights to peasants.
an end to Diaz's
The date he
rule,
chose was
and
November
the restoration
20th,
of land rights to
1910.
peasants.
In Chihuahua,
The date he
the
chose
first sparks
was
flew.
the 20th of November,
Peasants and ranchers rose up, not for
1910.
political philosophy,
In Chihuahua,
but for land,
the first
dignity,
sparks
and
flew.
revenge.
Peasants and ranchers
And once
rose
the
up,
uprising began,
not for political
it moved
philosophy,
faster
but
than
for
Madero
land,
could control.
dignity, and revenge.
Within months,
And once the uprising
Diaz
began,
realized his grip was
it
failing.
moved faster than Madero
In
could control.
1911, under
Within
pressure
months,
from both rebels
Diaz
and moderates,
realized his grip was
he
failing.
resigned and fled
In
into
1911, under pressure
Madero
from both
won the
rebels and
presidential
moderates,
election that
he
November.
resigned and fled
But
into
revolutions,
exile.
once
Madero
unleashed,
won the presidential
rarely
election
stop at the ballot
that
box.
November.
The men and
But
women who had
revolutions,
taken up
once
arms
unleashed,
expected land.
rarely stop
What
at the
they got
ballot
was
box.
another politician.
The men and women who had taken up
Madero,
arms
now
expected
president,
land. What they
urged
got
the
was
peasants
another
to disarm.
politician. Madero,
Promising
now
reform would come
president,
through
urged
legal
the peasants
channels.
to disarm,
But in
promising
Morelos,
reform would come
a young
through legal
leader
channels.
named Emiliano
But in
Zapata
Morelos,
had seen enough.
a young leader named
Zapata
Emiliano
rejected
Zapata
Madero's
had
delay
seen enough.
and published
Zapata
his own
rejected
manifesto,
Madero's delay
the Plan of
and
Ayala,
published his own manifesto.
15 points of land,
The Plan of
justice,
Ayala.
and autonomy.
15 points of land,
no
justice,
waiting,
and autonomy.
no disarming,
No waiting.
no more faith in elites.
No disarming.
To Zapata,
No
the
more
land
faith in
belonged
elites.
to those who worked it.
To Zapata,
and no
the
government
land belonged
had
to
the
those
right
who
to
worked
delay
it,
that
and no
justice.
government had the right to delay
the
that
conflict
justice.
between Zapata and
The conflict
Madero
between
mirrored
Zapata
a
and
deeper
Madero
tension in the
mirrored a
revolution
deeper
itself.
tension in the revolution
Was it about
itself.
democracy or
Was it about
redistribution?
democracy or
Was it a
redistribution?
political reform?
Was it a political
or a social
reform
revolution?
or a
Madero
social
found
revolution?
himself caught in the middle,
Madero found himself caught in the middle, alienating both the conservative military
radical
elite
peasantry.
and the radical peasantry.
In February 1913,
In February,
that fragile balance collapsed.
1913,
General Victoriano Huerta,
that fragile balance
once
collapsed.
trusted by Madero,
General
joined
Victoriano
with
Huerta,
reactionary
once
officers
trusted by
and
Madero,
launched a coup.
joined with
The
reactionary
American
officers
ambassador,
and launched
Henry
a coup.
Lane Wilson,
The American
lent
ambassador,
his tacit approval,
Henry Lane
believing
Wilson,
Huerta could bring
lent his
stability
tacit approval,
and protect
believing
US
Huerta
business
could bring
interests in
stability
Mexico.
and protect U.S.
betrayal
business
was
interests
swift
in
and
Mexico.
brutal.
The betrayal
Madero
was
was
swift
arrested,
and brutal.
along with his vice
Madero
president.
was arrested,
Days later,
along with his
both
vice
were
president.
assassinated in custody.
Days later,
the decade's
both were
first
assassinated
democratically
in
elected
custody.
leader
The decade's
dead.
first
Huerta
democratically
took power,
elected leader
but peace did not
was
follow.
dead. Huerta
Instead,
took power,
his coup
but peace
galvanized
did
a new
not follow.
coalition.
Instead, his coup galvanized a new coalition, the Constitutionalists, who pledged to overthrow him. Leading them was Venustiano Carranza,
but the true strength
a
of the
northern
movement
governor.
lay with men like Álvaro
But the true strength of the movement lay with men like Álvaro
and a certain
Obregón,
former
a
bandit
brilliant
turned
general,
commander, known
and a
across
certain
the north
former
as Pancho Villa.
bandit-turned-commander,
Pancho Villa had
known
been
across the
many
north
things.
as Pancho
A thief,
Villa.
a
Pancho
fugitive,
Villa had been
a
many
folk hero.
things: a thief,
But by
a fugitive,
1914,
a folk
he was
hero.
something else
But by
entirely.
1914,
The commander of the
he was
División
something
del
else
Norte,
entirely.
the most powerful
The
cavalry
commander
force
of the
in
División
revolutionary
del
Mexico.
Norte, the
Villa's
most
troops were
powerful
not polished.
cavalry force
They rode
in
in battered
revolutionary
boots,
Mexico.
wielded worn
Villa's
rifles,
troops were
and
not
sang
polished.
corridos between
They rode in
battles.
battered boots,
But their passion was unmatched.
wielded worn rifles,
Alongside
and
Obregón's
sang
forces,
corridos between
they battered
battles.
Huerta's army,
But their
winning
passion
key
was
battles
unmatched.
across the north and center
Alongside
of the country.
Obregón's forces,
The turning
they
point
battered
came in
Huerta's
April
army,
1914,
winning key
when
battles
US
across the
Marines
north and
occupied
center of the
Veracruz.
country. The turning point
Ostensibly,
came in April
response to a diplomatic incident.
1914,
But in truth,
when
Washington
U.S.
had
Marines
grown wary of
occupied
Huerta,
Veracruz,
and now sought
ostensibly
a
in
regime
response to
more
a
favorable
diplomatic
American
incident.
interests.
But in truth,
Namely, Carranza's.
Washington had grown wary
With
of
Veracruz
Huerta
blockaded,
and now sought a
Huerta's
regime
supply
more
lines
favorable to
collapsed.
American
By
interests,
July,
namely
he fled into exile.
Carranza's.
The
With
revolution,
Veracruz
once
blockaded,
again, had changed hands.
Huerta's supply lines collapsed.
But unity would not
By
last.
July,
Zapata
he fled
still
into
controlled
exile.
the south.
The revolution,
Villa commanded the north.
once again,
Carranza
had
ruled in the
changed
center.
hands.
And
But
none
unity
of them
would not
trusted the
last.
others.
Zapata
In
still
October
controlled the
1914,
south.
revolutionaries
Villa
met
commanded
in
the north.
Aguascalientes to
Carranza
decide the
ruled
country's
in the
future.
center, and none of them
Zapata
trusted
and
the
Villa
others.
pushed for
In
sweeping
October
land reform.
1914,
The alliance
revolutionaries met in
shattered, and Mexico
Aguascalientes
fell
to
into
decide
civil
the
war.
country's future.
The Aguascalientes
Zapata and
Convention
Villa
had failed not
pushed for
just in
sweeping
diplomacy,
land reform.
but in imagination.
Carranza refused.
The men
alliance
seated around
shattered,
its long tables
and Mexico
still believed they could
fell
contain
into
a
civil
revolution
war.
already
The
unchained.
Aguascalientes Convention had failed
Zapata returned
not
to
just in
Morelos.
diplomacy,
Villa
but in
marched on
imagination.
Mexico City.
The men seated
And
around
Carranza,
its long
the
tables
former
still
ally,
believed they could
became the new
contain a
enemy.
revolution already
In
unchained.
December 1914,
Zapata returned to
Villa and
Morelos.
Zapata took control
Villa
of the
marched
capital,
on Mexico
but they were
City,
not
and
interested in
Carranza,
governing.
the former ally,
Villa, blunt as
became
always,
the new
told
enemy.
Zapata,
In December
I am a fighter, not a statesman.
1914,
I learned to read
Villa
and
and
write
Zapata
just
took
2 years
control
ago.
of the capital.
It would
But they
be
were
bad
not
for
interested in
Mexico
governing.
if an uneducated
Villa,
man were to be president.
blunt as always, told Zapata,
Instead,
I
they
am a
installed
fighter,
Eulalio
not a
Gutierrez
statesman.
as
I
interim
learned to read
president
and write just 2
and
years
returned
ago.
to their home
It would be
territories.
bad for Mexico
But this absence
if an
from the political
uneducated man
center
were to be
proved
president.
disastrous.
Instead, they installed
Álvaro
Eulalio
Obregón,
Gutierrez
still
as
loyal to
interim
Carranza,
president and
took
returned
the
to their home
opportunity to
territories.
reorganize and
But
modernize
this
the
absence
army.
from the political center
In early
proved
1915,
disastrous.
he launched
Álvaro
a brutal
Obregón,
counteroffensive.
still loyal
Obregón
to Carranza,
was no ordinary general.
took the
He
opportunity
understood
to
not
reorganize
just the
and
terrain of
modernize the
Mexico,
army.
but the
In
terrain
early
of men's minds.
1915,
He embraced new tactics,
he launched a
studied
brutal
foreign armies,
counteroffensive.
and used machine guns
Obregón
like
was no
paintbrushes
ordinary
on a bloody
general.
canvas.
He understood
In April,
not just
he
the terrain
defeated
of
Villa
Mexico,
at Celaya.
but the
In
terrain
July,
of men's
he
minds.
crushed the northern
He
army
embraced
at
new tactics,
Aguascalientes.
studied foreign
Villa's
armies,
dreams
and
and
used
his
machine
División
guns
del
like
Norte
paintbrushes on a
were
bloody
shattered.
canvas.
He
In
retreated to
April,
the mountains,
had defeated
a
Villa at
bandit once
Celaya.
more.
In July,
Obregón
he
had
crushed
also
the northern
suffered,
army at
losing his right arm in
Aguascalientes.
battle.
Villa's
But he had
dreams and his
gained
División
something
del
greater,
Norte were shattered.
dominance.
He retreated to the mountains.
Meanwhile,
A
Zapata
bandit
held
once
Morelos
more.
in a quiet
Obregón
kind of
had also
resistance.
suffered losing his right arm
There,
in battle.
he implemented his
But
vision,
he had gained something
the
greater,
Morelos Commune,
dominance.
redistributing
Meanwhile,
land, forming peasant
Zapata
councils,
held Morelos in
and
a
building a
quiet
microcosm
kind of resistance.
the revolution's promise.
There, he implemented
But
his
Carranza
vision, the Morelos Commune,
would
redistributing
not
land,
tolerate autonomy.
forming peasant councils,
By
and
late
building a
1918,
microcosm of the
he
revolution's
ordered General
promise.
Pablo González
But
to crush
Carranza
Zapata's enclave.
would not tolerate autonomy.
Zapata, desperate for allies,
1917
reached out to the
he
Bolsheviks in
ordered
Russia.
General Pablo
He also
González
tried
to
to turn
crush
one of
Zapata's
González's
enclave.
colonels, Jesus
Zapata,
Guajardo,
desperate
to his
for
side.
allies, reached
It was
out
a
to the
trap.
Bolsheviks in Russia.
On April 10th,
He also tried to turn
1919,
one of González's
Zapata rode
colonels,
out for what
Jesus
he believed
Guajardo,
was
to
a
his side.
negotiation.
It was a trap.
Instead, he
On the
was
10th of
ambushed
April,
and gunned down. The heart of the peasant
1919,
revolution bled into
Zapata
the soil,
rode out for what
while
he believed
Mexico
was a
tore itself
negotiation.
apart. The
Instead,
United
he was
States
ambushed and
watched
gunned down.
and waited.
The heart of the
At
peasant
first,
revolution
President Woodrow Wilson
bled
had
into
hesitated
the
to
soil.
pick sides.
While Mexico
He had
tore
denounced
itself
Huerta,
apart, the
flirted
United
with
States
Villa,
watched
and quietly
waited.
supported Carranza.
At first,
But when
President President
Villa,
Woodrow Wilson
enraged
had
by
hesitated
American
to pick
recognition of
sides.
Carranza's regime,
He had denounced
crossed the border
Huerta,
into New Mexico,
flirted with
and
Villa,
killed 17 Americans
and
at
quietly
Columbus.
supported Carranza.
Everything changed.
But
It was
when
the first
Villa,
invasion of U.S.
enraged
soil
by
since the
American
War of
recognition of
1812.
Carranza's regime,
Public outrage
crossed the border
exploded.
into New Mexico
Wilson
and killed
responded with a
17
punitive
Americans at
expedition.
Columbus.
10,000
everything
men
changed.
under General John
It was
J.
the first
Pershing.
invasion of U.S.
They
soil
crossed the
since the
border
War
in
of
pursuit of Villa, chasing shadows
1812.
across the Sierra
Public
Madre.
outrage
They
exploded.
never caught him.
Wilson responded with
Villa
a
knew
punitive
the land.
expedition,
His
10,000
men
men under
melted
General
into
John
hills
J.
and
Pershing.
ravines.
They crossed
struck
the
at
border
dusk
in
and
pursuit of
disappeared
Villa,
by dawn.
chasing shadows
One American
across the
report
Sierra
from a
Madre.
skirmish near
They never
Tomachic
caught
reads,
him. Villa
the
knew the
bandits
land.
were not concentrated,
His men melted into
but
hills
scattered
and
along the
ravines.
crest of the mountains.
They struck at
There
dusk
was no possible way
and
of getting
disappeared
around
by
them
dawn.
before dark.
One American report from a
Pershing
skirmish
marched over
near
500
Tomochic
kilometers
reads,
into Mexico.
the bandits were not
He returned
concentrated,
empty-handed.
but scattered along
The
the
longer
crest
the
of the
U.S.
mountains.
remained, the
There was
more
no
tense
possible
relations
way
grew.
of getting around them
By
before
June
dark.
1916,
Pershing
Carranza
marched over
demanded their
500
withdrawal.
kilometers into Mexico.
Small skirmishes
He
broke
returned
out between
empty-handed.
U.S. and Mexican
The longer
forces.
the U.S. remained,
Then came the Zimmerman
the more
telegram,
tense relations
a
grew.
secret German
By June
proposal
1000,
urging Mexico to join a war against the United States.
Carranza demanded their
Wilson
withdrawal.
now faced pressure
Small
on two fronts.
skirmishes broke out
Europe
between
demanded
U.S.
his
and Mexican
attention.
forces.
Mexico was no
Then
longer
came
a
the
priority.
Zimmerman telegram,
In January
a secret
1917,
German
the
proposal
American
urging
troops
Mexico
withdrew.
to join a
Villa
war
had
against the
survived,
United States.
But his time was ending.
Wilson now
In the
faced
wake
pressure
of
on
Zapata's
two
assassination
fronts.
and Villa's
Europe
retreat,
demanded his attention.
Carranza moved
Mexico
to
was no
consolidate
longer
power.
a priority.
He knew
In
that
January
promises had to be made,
1917,
even if only on
the American
paper.
troops withdrew.
So in early
Villa had
1917,
survived,
Mexico
but his
unveiled
time
a
was
new
ending.
constitution.
In the wake of Zapata's
It was,
assassination
by the
and Villa's
standards of the
retreat,
day,
Carranza
radical.
moved to consolidate power.
Land reform
He knew
and
that promises
redistribution,
had to be made, even if
labor
only on paper.
protections,
So, in
minimum
early
wage,
1917,
secular
Mexico
education,
unveiled a
and
new
limits on the
constitution.
church.
It was,
Restrictions
by the
on
standards
foreign
of
land
the day,
ownership.
radical.
The elite balked.
Land reform
One
and
former minister
redistribution,
under Diaz
labor
called it
protections,
the bastard offspring
minimum
of
wage,
hatred.
maternity
But Carranza's
leave,
position was strong.
secular education and
militarily
limits
and
on the
politically.
church,
He was
restrictions on
elected
foreign
president
land
that
ownership.
year,
The elite
unopposed.
balked. One
Obregón,
former minister
his
under
old general,
Diaz
was
called
quietly
it
pushed
the
aside.
bastard offspring of hatred.
Carranza now
But
turned his
Carranza's
focus
position
on
was
one
strong
remaining
militarily
threat,
and politically.
Zapata's legacy.
He was elected president
Morelos
that year,
had been brought
unopposed.
to heel.
Obregón,
But the idea of
his old
peasant
general,
revolution still
was quietly
smoldered.
pushed aside.
Even former
Carranza now
Zapatistas
turned
were
his
beginning to
focus
align
on one
with
remaining
Obregón.
threat,
By
Zapata's legacy.
1920, Carranza's grip
Morelos
was
had
slipping.
been brought to heel,
His economic reforms
but the
had
idea
stalled.
of peasant
His
revolution
enemies,
still
once
smoldered.
scattered,
Even
were now
former
reuniting.
Zapatistas
And then he
were
made
beginning
a
to
fatal
align
mistake.
with Obregón.
He tried to impose
By
a successor of
1920,
his choosing. The
Carranza's grip
military,
was slipping.
especially Obregón's
His economic
faction,
reforms had
saw
stalled.
it as a power grab.
His enemies, once
Obregón
scattered,
fled the capital,
were now
but
reuniting.
not in retreat.
And then
He raised
he made
an
a
army.
fatal mistake.
He marched with
He
the
tried to
support of many
impose a
governors.
successor of his
And
choosing.
Carranza, just
The
like
military,
Diaz before him,
especially
ran for
Obregón's
Veracruz.
faction, saw it as a
He
power
never
grab.
made it.
Obregón
On May
fled the
21st,
capital,
1920,
but
one
not
of his
in
own
retreat.
men turned on
He
him
raised
as
an
he
army.
slept.
He marched
shot
with the
him dead.
support of many governors.
Carranza's death
And
was
Carranza,
not just the fall
just
of a
like
man.
Diaz before
It
him,
was the death of a
ran
phase
for
of the
Veracruz.
revolution.
He
The
never
death
made
of its
it.
old ideals,
On May
its
21,
moderate promises, and its
1920,
illusion of control.
one of his own
With
men
Carranza
turned on
dead,
him as he
there
slept
remained
and
one
shot him
man
dead.
with both the army
Carranza's
and the
death was not
credibility
just
to
the
take
fall
power.
of a man.
Álvaro
It was the
Obregón.
death of a phase of
He
the
was missing
revolution,
an arm,
the death of its
but not
old
ambition.
ideals, its
He
moderate
had betrayed,
promises,
outmaneuvered,
and its illusion
and
of
outlasted
control.
every rival.
With Carranza dead,
And now,
there
he
remained
stood
one
alone
man
atop the ruins
with both
of a
the army
revolution.
and
But
the
Obregón
credibility
was not
to
merely
take
a general.
power. Álvaro
He was
Obregón.
pragmatic.
He was missing an arm,
In July
but not
1920,
ambition.
Pancho Villa,
He had betrayed,
battered, but unbowed,
outmaneuvered,
agreed
and
to lay down
outlasted
his
every
arms in
rival.
exchange for a
And now,
pension and a
he stood
sprawling
alone
estate.
atop the
This
ruins of
time,
a revolution.
there were no tricks,
But Obregón was
no
not merely
assassins
a
in the
general,
night,
he was pragmatic.
just an understanding.
In July
The
1000,
war was over.
920,
Obregón ruled
Pancho
as a
Villa
transitional
battered,
figure,
but
a bridge
unbowed
between
agreed to lay down
radicals
his
and
arms
conservatives,
in exchange
between
for a
chaos
pension and a
and
sprawling
something resembling
estate.
order.
This time,
On December
there were
1st,
no tricks,
1920,
no
he was
assassins in the
sworn
night,
in as president
just an
of
understanding.
Mexico.
The
For
war was
many
over.
historians, this
Obregón
marks the
ruled
end
as a
of the Mexican
transitional figure,
Revolution.
a
But not
bridge
all
between
agree.
radicals and conservatives,
Some argue the
between
revolution
chaos
never truly
and
ended.
something resembling
It merely
order.
changed form.
On the 1st of December,
Others suggest it lasted until the 1940s,
1920,
when its
he
final
was sworn in as
ideological
president
echoes
of Mexico.
were absorbed into the
For many
Institutional
historians,
Revolutionary
this
Party,
marks the end of the
PRI.
Mexican Revolution.
What is
But
clear,
not all
however,
agree.
is that
Some argue
Obregón's
the
rule
revolution
brought a
never
measure
truly
of
ended,
stability
it merely
at
changed diminished form.
cost.
Others
His
suggest it
government
lasted until the
offered concessions to
1940s,
peasants
when
and
its
former
final
Zapatistas,
ideological echoes were
land
absorbed
grants,
into the Institutional
recognition,
Revolutionary
symbolic
Party,
gestures.
PRI.
Yet at the
What is
same
clear,
time,
however,
he silenced
is that
opposition,
Obregón's rule
crushed
brought a
new
measure of
uprisings,
stability
and even targeted
at a
former
cost.
allies.
His government offered
In
concessions
1923,
to peasants
Pancho Villa
and
was
former
assassinated,
Zapatistas' land
likely on
grants,
Obregón's
recognition,
orders. 5
symbolic
years later,
gestures.
Obregón himself
Yet at the
was
same
gunned down by a
time,
Catholic
he
fanatic,
silenced opposition,
just weeks after
crushed
winning
new
a second
uprisings,
term.
and even
And so
targeted
the
former
cycle
allies.
continued. Part
In
8.
1923,
The legacy
Pancho
and the
Villa
lie.
was
The
assassinated,
revolution
likely
had
on
begun with
Obregón's
dreams
orders.
of democracy.
5 years later,
It ended with
Obregón
political
himself was gunned
assassinations
down by a
and
Catholic
single-party
fanatic
system
just
that would
weeks
rule
after
Mexico
winning a
for
second
70
term.
years.
And so the cycle
So what,
continued.
in the end, did
The revolution had
achieve?
begun with dreams of
The
democracy.
1917
It
Constitution,
ended with political
still in force
assassinations
today,
and a
marked a
single-party
major shift
system
in Latin
that would
American
rule
political
Mexico
thought.
for 70 years.
It was one of the
So
first
what,
national
in
charters
the end,
to enshrine social rights.
did the revolution
land,
achieve?
labor,
The
education. It inspired left-wing movements
1,917
across the region.
Constitution still in
It
force
gave
today
language to the poor.
marked a major
hope to
shift
the dispossessed.
in Latin American political
But
thought.
hopes written on
It was one of the
paper
first
do not
national
plow the
charters to
fields
enshrine
or build the
social
schools.
rights.
Much of
Land,
the redistribution
labor,
promised to peasants
education. It
stalled. Foreign
inspired
companies
left-wing
still
movements
controlled
across
vast
the
oil
region.
fields.
It gave language
The
to the
military
poor.
remained a
It
political
gave hope
force,
to the
and the
dispossessed.
church remained a cultural
But hopes written on
stronghold.
paper do not plow the fields or
More
build the
tellingly,
schools.
The
Much
very
of the
revolution that
redistribution
decried
promised to peasants
dictatorship
stalled.
eventually gave
Foreign
rise to a
companies
one-party
still
state,
controlled vast
the
oil
PRI,
fields. The
that ruled
military remained a
unopposed for most
political
of the 20th
force,
century.
and the church
Its
remained a
leaders
cultural
claimed the mantle
stronghold.
of Zapata and
More
Villa,
tellingly, the
while
very
silencing
revolution that
dissent with the
decried
same
dictatorship
ruthlessness
eventually
as
gave
Diaz
rise
and
to a
Huerta.
one-party state, the
As
PRI,
one bitter Mexican
that ruled
intellectual put it,
unopposed for most
the
of the 20th
revolution
century.
devoured its
Its
fathers,
leaders claimed the
and then
mantle of
became a
Zapata
church
and
to
Villa
justify their
while
ghosts.
silencing dissent with the
9.
same
A
ruthlessness
nation
as
of
Diaz
masks.
and Huerta. As
The
one
Mexican
bitter
Revolution
Mexican
was not a
intellectual
clean
put it,
war.
the revolution
was
devoured
messy,
its fathers,
fragmented,
and then became a church to
contradictory.
justify their ghosts.
Zapata fought
The
for
Mexican
the landless,
Revolution was not
but
a clean
distrusted
war.
national politics.
It was messy,
Villa stood
fragmented,
for the poor, but
contradictory.
executed enemies without trial.
Zapata
Carranza
fought
wrote
for
the
the
most
landless,
progressive constitution
but
of his
distrusted
time,
national
then betrayed
politics.
nearly every ally
Villa
he ever
stood for the
had.
poor,
Obregón
but
restored
executed
order,
enemies
then
without
ruled through
trial.
fear and secret
Carranza
deals.
wrote the most progressive
Each man wore many
constitution of his
faces.
time,
Each
then
victory
betrayed
contained
nearly
the
every
seeds of its
ally
own
he ever
defeat.
had.
Yet in
Obregón
their
restored
struggles,
order,
in the
then ruled
betrayals,
through fear
the
and secret
manifestos,
deals.
the raids and
Each
reforms,
man
something
wore
new
many
was born.
faces. Each
Mexico
victory
shed its
contained the
19th century
seeds
skin.
of its own defeat.
It became modern,
Yet in their struggles
not
and the
in the way of Europe,
betrayals, the
with clean lines
manifestos,
and rational
the
laws,
raids and reforms,
but in its
something
own
new
way,
was born.
layered, tragic,
Mexico
and
shed
bold.
its 19th century
A
skin.
Mexico of contradiction,
It became
a
modern,
Mexico of revolution.
not in the way of Europe,
The final irony
with
of the
clean
Mexican
lines
Revolution
and rational
is this:
laws, but in its own
greatest
way,
triumph was survival,
layered, tragic,
not of the leaders,
and bold.
not of the slogans,
A Mexico
but of
of
the people,
contradiction,
against
a
bandits
Mexico
and generals,
of revolution.
against foreign